Talking Washington football with Chris Fetters. You can join him on Dogman. It's the 247 Sports platform for Washington athletics. I'm looking at the recruiting class right now as it stands, and we're all getting accustomed to December being basically the 75 to 80% haul for most Power 5 teams. And for right now, that means a 17th ranked recruiting class nationally, number 2 in the Pac-12, and 20 players have signed at this point. For you, what stands out and what has yet to be accomplished?
Well, Mark, I think it's really interesting because, I think there's been some analysis that's been done when you look at the top college teams and just whether you look at the Alabamas or the Clemsons or the Ohio States or what have you, there's one kind of common denominator the last, 5-10 years in terms of what's really made them outstanding. And that's their dominance on the offensive and defensive lines. They have just been bigger, more powerful, more explosive, have just allowed their offenses to and defenses to do what they want to do because they can dictate what's going on in the trenches. And Washington did a really nice job last year of signing some big-time offensive and defensive linemen, and they did the exact same thing for 2019. They signed 4 offensive linemen and 4 defensive linemen. And all of them are considered really good players. It's interesting that Washington signed actually a junior college offensive lineman, a kid named Corey Luciano, who is going to come in with 3 years to play 3. But Washington usually does not sign junior college players. They just don't have the academic ability to do so because their admission standards are a little bit higher than most in the Pac-12. But this kid is a special kid, and he showed really, really well on film. He was in the Bay Area, Diablo Valley, and he played with Jay Kaner and Peyton Henry in high school. So the coaches kind of had an in with him because they kind of knew all about him from his time at Monte Vista High School in Danville. So, he's one guy. But then, you look at a couple of these other offensive linemen. You look at a guy like Corey Bulow or Julius Bulow, for instance, from Kapolei in Hawaii. This kid's he's listed at 6'8", 331 pounds. I don't care what you want to make out of that guy, but that's the kind of clay you want to build with. That's the kind of mold that they want to have a tackle be. And then they have another kid, Nate Kalepo from Rainier Beach here in Seattle, who's 6'6", 341. Last year they got a kid, MJ Ale, who is 6'5", 360. They're bringing in some absolute beef when it comes to it. And then I think, to be honest with you, the most underheralded offensive lineman in the class to me is a kid named Troy Fautanu from Liberty High School outside of Las Vegas in Henderson, Nevada. Now, he's a moderately sized offensive lineman at only 6'4", 290, but he is a kid who got on the national radar really in a hurry when Liberty hosted IMG Academy with guys like Trey Sanders and some of those other national recruits. Well, probably the biggest national recruit for IMG is their defensive end named Nolan Smith, who signed with Georgia. Well, all of the firsthand accounts that we've heard from guys at 24/7 that were there and other people said that Troy Fautanu just absolutely manhandled Nolan Smith, absolutely neutralized him. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with him because I think he's more of an interior guy for sure. But that when you look at that kind of a kid, in like USC was in on him, and they really wanted him badly, but he was Washington all the way as soon as he committed. So that was a big thing. But then you flip it to the defensive line, and they've gotten 4 absolute studs. The guy who's the real sleeper of this group of 4 is a kid named Noah Ngalu from Menlo Atherton in the Bay Area. Same league that Ben Burkervin was from. I think Ben was at Sacred Heart, but this kid's from Menlo Atherton, and he's only about 6'1", 280 as a defensive lineman. But when I talked to Akaika Malloy, the Washington defensive line coach, during the Rose Bowl practices about him, because the coaches can now talk about the signees. And when I asked him, he said, how did he get on the radar when you were looking at all these other guys? He goes, it's really funny because we started watching film of him, and the first film I ever watched of him when he was a sophomore, he was maybe 260, 270, he was playing running back. That's the kind of athlete they're talking about. And the other guy that used to be a running back in the Bay Area that they ended up signing was Vita Vea. So that'll tell you a little bit about the kind of athlete that they're looking for on the defensive line. And Noah Ngalu, yeah, he's going to fall under the radar because of the other three guys they signed. But this kid is a pure athlete. I think he's going to do some damage. But then you look at a kid like Sama Pa'ama he's from Waipahu, which is way over on the west side of the island of Oahu, but he goes to school in Kaimuki, which is right by Waikiki. And this kid is a two-way stud. He's listed at 6'4", 336, and he was the team's kicker. So this kid is just an amazing, amazing athlete. I know he just put out his YouTube highlight. If you look up Sama Pa'ama, Sampaama, and he is just a one-man wrecking crew, a one-man wrecking. He just obliterates kids. I don't even know how else to describe it. And then there's another kid on the islands from Hawaii that they picked up who's, I think, if I remember from the 24/7 ratings, he's the highest rated kid that they had on the board, a kid named Fa'atui Tuitele. And he's 6'3", 304, but he comes from St. Louis in the ILH, which is the highest kind of, it's the interscholastic league of Honolulu, which is the private school. So it's St. Louis, it's Kamehameha, it's Punahou, it's Iolani, it's schools like that. And St. Louis is obviously at the cream of the crop right now. People will remember that's where Tua Tagovailoa played. And there's been so many other guys that have obviously come from St. Louis, including like Marcus Mariota, for instance. So it's a very heralded school. And this kid is apparently like the Pied Piper of the recruits in this class in terms of when he made a decision to commit to Washington, all the people in Hawaii really stood up and took note. It's like, okay, if a guy like Fa'atui Tuitele is looking at Washington really seriously, then we need to start really paying attention to what guys like Akaika Molloy and Keith Bonifa, who played at Hawaii, the running backs coach and recruiting coordinator for Washington. We got to look at what these guys are doing. So Fa'atui Tuitele was a huge piece. He's going to be playing tomorrow, Saturday, at the All-American Bowl in San Antonio, and so it'll be fun to watch him play a little bit. And then the final guy who had to skip the All-American Bowl because he's actually going to be enrolling in the next couple days at Washington is a kid from the Bay Area by the name of Jacob Bandis. And he's a kid at 6'2", 315 from Pittsburgh High School in the Bay Area. And I don't know if he's familiar to you at all, Mark, but he's a kid. If you paid attention to the opening at all, the big 7-on-7 competition they have in the summer that Nike's really involved with, it's on ESPN, what have you. Well, they have an offensive and defensive lineman component to that now. The last 4 or 5 years they've added to it. And Jacob Bandis was basically the best defensive player. He got the MVP award for the best defensive lineman in that group. He's an absolute bull. I mean, an absolute bull. When people look at what Greg Gaines did this year for Washington, I know Phil Steele just named him as a 4-team All-American. He won the Morris Trophy, if you're aware of them. Do you know what the Morris Trophy is at all, Mark?
I do not.
So the Morris Trophy is really, not to get too far afield, but the Morris Trophy is a Pac-12 trophy that it is so unique and so cool. And I don't know if other conferences around the country do this, but about 30, 40 years ago, this family in Seattle came up with this idea of like, you know, the linemen just don't get enough credit. Offensive and defensive linemen are the guys that always do the dirty work, but they don't get the praise. We want to give an award, a Pac-12 award for the best offensive and defensive linemen in the conference. But here's the twist. They do it through a vote of their peers. So all the offensive and defensive linemen put in a vote as to who the hardest guy on the other side of the ball was to deal with. And this year, the Morris Trophy Awards for offense and defense both went to Washington players. Caleb McGarry on the offensive line and Greg Gaines on the defensive line. And so when I think of a guy like Greg Gaines and then I look at like a Jacob Bandis, I think of two very similar guys. I think Bandis might be a better athlete, pure athlete, than a guy like Gaines. But Gaines is an absolute pit bull, and I thought he had a really good Rose Bowl game. And I think a guy like Jacob Bandis, especially coming in early, and because Washington loses 3 seniors on the defensive line with Gaines and Jalen Johnson and Shane Bowman, I think there's a really good chance a guy like Bandis could come in and maybe make an impact. I know I will bet the ranch that he will play at least those 4 games that they're allowed to and still redshirt. But would it surprise me if he played more? No, it wouldn't at all, because they're going to be really young along the defensive line, but they're going to be supremely talented. And I think that guy could be as good as any of them.
Bandis is the 8th-rated defensive tackle in the country, as Chris mentions, from Pittsburgh, California, according to 247 Sports. And obviously, this award, the Morris Award, this speaks volumes because, especially along the line, I believe that the media, we sometimes miss it because there's a lot of reputation involved. There's a lot of who was the best last year, and if they don't screw it up, if they're considered the best, so we don't have stats to rely on, who's focusing, especially on the offensive line. Defensive line, we have some stats, but they're skewed. They're very much based on matchups and double teaming, and that comes into play. So if the peers within the conference are able to point out one guy to win an award, that's tremendous.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is, and it's something where the award ceremony happens at the Washington Athletic Club downtown Seattle, and so I've been to a bunch of them, and Vita Vea won it the year before on defense, and I know that some like DeForest Buckner won it, the guy he was with Oregon and now he's with the 49ers, but you can go down the list. I mean, I could go down the list of Morris Trophy winners, and you'd know every one of them. I mean, it's literally a who's who of some of the best offensive defensive linemen that have ever come out of the conference. And so for guys like McGarry and Gaines to win it, again, like you said, when it's the players going up against them are giving them the credit, then I think that's the thing that really, to me, puts the Morris Trophy above any sort of all Pac-12 or even all American mentions, because that really goes to show that the people that are playing against these guys are giving them the ultimate sign of respect.
Absolutely. And Chris, you touch upon something that we try to accomplish here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Obviously, if people go to team-specific sites, whether that's from a video standpoint or to read articles, then you're going to get the in-depth analysis. If you go to what I try to do in terms of giving a national perspective, then you may hear about, if you get the Washington guy on for 5 minutes, about Browning and Gaskin, because everybody knows who they are. And maybe Burke Hervin gets a mention, but I love the personnel breakdown and try to go in depth with guys like yourselves for the hardcore fans.